Chapter 14. "Of course," said Humphrey Wells, pausing to mop his forehead on the hem of his conjurer's cloak. "I'm probably being overcautious, which is something of an occupational hazard with villains. After all, you know that I transformed my Uncle John into something, but you haven't got the faintest idea what. Accordingly, you don't really pose any sort of threat to me. Still, I happen to believe in attention to detail." He grinned and continued sawing. He was about 2/3 of the way through. Inside the box, Mr. Tanner's mum had stopped kicking and screaming and was now lying ominously still. "Furthermore," he continued, raising his voice slightly over the grating sound of the saw, "I could probably have forced young Arthur here to tell me where the talisman's hidden just by threatening to saw his sweetheart in two, without actually doing it. But I've been waiting for a pretext to get my own back on the miserable bitch for 200 years. Arthur made a faint squealing noise and tried to struggle, but it didn't do any good. Humphrey's restraining spell held him tight in his chair, as firmly as though the ropes and gag had been real hempen cloth rather than some magical effect. The others didn't even try to move or make a noise. Real rope can be surreptitiously cut, burnt, or frayed. The immaterial version is far less vulnerable. "Of course," Humphrey added, "you're probably all wondering what I'm going to do with you once I've got my hands on this talisman. Good question. I've been asking myself the same thing. I suppose I should maroon you all in that poky little room. But as we've all seen, that's not necessarily a permanent solution. Turning you all into things has a certain appeal, and once I've got the talisman, it'll be the proverbial piece of cake. Or I suppose I could just kill the lot of you and have done with it. That would be the sensible course." He sighed. "But my trouble is, I'm far too tender-hearted. It'd be untrue to say I couldn't hurt a fly, but I think I draw the line at 5, no, make that 6 cold-blooded murders, since this time I'd have to do for poor old Uncle John as well. Who knows, I might even let you all go for all the harm you could possibly do to me." It was at this point, for the first time, that Paul genuinely wished he was good at magic. A proper, fully trained wizard, he felt, would be able to get free from the invisible ropes, turn Humphrey into a gnat, and cause a heavy object to fall on him and deprive him of a dimension, all with a twitch of the nose or a waggle of an eyebrow. But Paul wasn't a proper wizard. Never had been one, and never would be one. Not now. Pity, he thought. That wasn't what he regretted most. The true bitch of it was that Sophie loved him. God only knew why. And any minute now he'd be dead, or transformed into a gerbil. Did gerbils love, he wondered? Naturally, he'd still worship and adore Sophie if she was a gerbil, but would a gerbil-eyed Sophie still love him, or would all that sort of thing get filtered out in the transformation process? In any event, it wasn't fair, and if only he could get his hands free, he'd have a good mind to write to Esther Ranson about it. Humphrey had stopped sawing. He was leaning against the table and breathing heavily. "Actually," he puffed, "make that 7 cold-blooded murders, because I don't suppose Dennis Tanner's going to take kindly to having his dear old mum sawn in half. Still, he's been a thorn in my side for far too long, and besides, I've never really liked him much." He put one hand on each half of the box and slid them gently apart. "Now," he said, looking at Arthur, "let's not muck about. You can see I'm serious, so don't bother telling lies or playing for time. I want that talisman, please." He snapped his fingers and Arthur nearly fell out of his chair. "Come along," Humphrey chided. "I've got a lot of things to see to after I've dealt with you people, so don't waste my time." Arthur stood up. He was shaking all over, Paul noticed. Couldn't blame him for that. "Very well," he said quietly. "But what assurance do I have that you'll put her back together again?" "My word as a gentleman, of course." "Ah," said Arthur bleakly. "To be honest, I was hoping for rather more than that." Humphrey smiled. "Tough," he said. "Did I mention that unless I put her back within 3 minutes, there won't be a lot of point?" Arthur closed his eyes briefly. Then he reached across the table and picked up Humphrey's conjurer's hat out of which he produced 3 white doves, a rabbit and a fine gold chain. The doves and the rabbit made themselves scarce. Arthur put the chain down on the table and said, "That's it." Humphrey, who'd been staring, made a sort of gurgling noise at the back of his throat. "Do you mean to tell me," he said at last, "that I've been carrying the wretched thing around with me for the last 130 years without knowing it?" "Oh, fool!" he laughed. "Well, I've got to admire your ingenuity," he said, "not to mention your nerve. And I'll forgive you for making me look a fool, because nobody's ever going to know. And as soon as I've disposed of this annoying little trinket, my confounded uncle won't be a problem any more." "As you wish," Arthur said. "Now, if you wouldn't mind—" What? Oh, yes, of course." Humphrey pulled the 2 halves of the box together. They closed with an audible snap. He folded back the lid, and Mr. Tanner's mum sat up, blinking. "You see," Humphrey said, "I did give you my word, after all." With a blood-curdling snarl, Mr. Tanner's mum suddenly drew a set of 3-inch claws and went to swipe Humphrey across the face with them, but he snapped his fingers, and she froze in mid-stroke. "As for you," he said, "I'm not quite finished with you yet." He snapped his fingers a second time, and Mr. Tanner's mum changed into a stunningly beautiful, voluptuous blonde, with no claws on. She shrieked, and to Paul's great surprise, blushed. "Turning me down," Humphrey said slowly, "is one thing. Turning me down and then making an exhibition of yourself chasing after that," a savage nod in Paul's direction, "is another matter entirely." He paused and then grinned at Arthur. "Oh, didn't anybody tell you?" he said conversationally. "Your own true love's been quite busy since you've been away, and her latest project is this half-baked excuse for a stick insect here. Do you know," he added with a smirk, "I've a good mind to maroon the 2 of you in your old rooms together for the rest of eternity, to give you plenty of time to discuss the matter in private." Paul opened his mouth to explain, but no words came out. Arthur looked at him and shook his head. "I don't believe you," he said. "My Rosie would never do anything like that." Humphrey threw his head back and laughed. "Priceless," he said. "Well, never mind. As I mentioned just now, I have some unfinished business with your sweet Rosie. Once I've finished with her, I'll send her along to join you in whatever place or setting you end up in. Unless, of course, she changes her mind about me, which is a lady's prerogative after all. She may decide that I'm preferable to 50 billion years in a confined space with you and your new friends. We'll have to see, won't we?" Humphrey snapped his fingers a 3rd time, and Arthur froze solid before he could say a word. "Now then," Humphrey went on, "what about your friend, young Philip here? Correct me if I'm wrong, but you were the one who tried to warn my dear uncle about me, thereby forcing my hand before I was quite ready. I believe it's only fair I should think up something particularly suitable for you. And Miss Pettingale," he added, "and Mr. Carpenter. It was none of your business, was it? But you had to go poking your noses in where they didn't belong. Let's see now. I do believe that shortly before you came here, Miss Pettingale and Mr. Carpenter had just discovered that they were part of the same happy ending. But we can easily fix that." He stood up and crossed the room to where Sophie's handbag lay on the floor. From it he took the plastic bottle, still over half full of clear golden liquid. "My uncle's own recipe," he said affectionately, "worth a fortune to us over the years. Let's think now. What permutation is likely to cause the most trouble?" He unscrewed the cap, and then he put his hand on Sophie's forehead and tilted her head back. "In about 20 minutes," he said, "you'll wake up and find yourself gazing in wonder into young Philip's small piggy eyes. But you're a strong-willed, bolshy little thing. You'll love our Pip with a frenzied passion that'll last until the sun goes cold. But all the time you will know at the back of your mind that he's not really the one. And since the 3 of you will be cooped up in that dingy little bedsit without even the option of a murder or suicide to break the tension, I imagine the atmosphere in there is going to be a little bit more than fraught. Paul couldn't bear to watch. He looked away at the ceiling and then down at the table with its mirror polish, on which stood that by now familiar object, the long stapler. A tiny part of his mind wondered how it had got there, since it hadn't been there a moment ago. But he was so used to it turning up and disappearing again that its latest manifestation didn't really bother him. He looked away at the moulding on the oak-panelled walls, and then something registered in his mind, and he looked back, not this time at the stapler itself, but at its reflection in the tabletop. The last time he'd been in this room, when Ricky Wormtorter had given him a dire warnings lecture and told him about the imp-reflecting qualities of that very table, he'd remembered thinking how curious was the manner in which the thing worked. You looked at the object, and then at its reflection, and the reflection was just a normal inverted image of the object. But at the same time, it was also something else. On that occasion, it had been the doomed Mr. Lundqvist, transformed into a mouse by some dark sorcery. This time, the stapler was just a stapler, but it was also a tiny little bald man, dressed in a black frock coat and grey striped trousers, crouched like a hunting cat and waving frantically at him with his tiny hands. "Fuck," thought Paul. "Mr. Wells Senior." "Yes," said a voice, very faint inside his head. "Now pay attention. When I break the spell, lay the chain over the stapler." "You what?" Paul thought, and then felt the unseen ropes give way abruptly, and he fell forward, just as Arthur had done when Humphrey had released him a while ago. Paul lost his balance and toppled out of his chair, but as he slid forward, he shot his hand out, grabbing for the little gold chain on the tabletop. He could just reach it, and as Humphrey whirled around, a vicious-looking sword in his uplifted hand, Paul flicked the chain through the air with his fingertips. More by luck than judgment, the chain flew through the air, clattered against the stapler, and wrapped itself around it like a ball-ass. At once, there was a blinding flash of blue light. Humphrey dropped the sword with a clatter and crashed against the wall as J.W.Wells, a short, stout man who looked like Arthur Lowe without his glasses on, stepped down from the table. "Thank you," he said politely to Paul. Then he clicked his sausage-like fingers. Several things happened all at once. Mr. Tanner's mum acquired a long dress of rose madder silk with zouave jacket and bustle. Arthur and Pip fell off their chairs and landed on their backsides on the floor. A snake of some sort, a boa constrictor or some sort of python, appeared out of thin air and coiled itself around Humphrey until only his nose and the tips of his shoes were visible. Sophie's head fell forward on her chest, and she snored loudly. John Wellington frowned and spat out a mouthful of staples. An empty plastic bottle rolled across the floor. Paul stared for a moment at the plastic bottle. Then he slumped forward, his head in his hands. Then he heard the voice of John Wellington directly above him. "Don't be ridiculous," he was saying, and Paul looked up sharply. John Wellington was frowning at him, and Paul expected him to say, "Stupid boy," at any moment. Instead, he heard a voice inside his head, the same one he'd heard a minute earlier, only louder this time. John Wellington clearly believed in discretion. "It's all right," said John Wellington inside his head. "It'll be at least 20 minutes before she wakes up, and so long as you're in position when the time comes, everything will be right as rain. Better, in fact." "Better?" Paul queried. "Quite so. Be realistic. True, the young lady does indeed love you, but nothing lasts forever. Under normal circumstances, I'd give it 18 months at the very most, and then she'd be off with someone else, someone quite unsuitable who'd make her very unhappy. This way is very much better for the both of you." "But that's not right," Paul stated. I can't take advantage." "It's not a matter of taking advantage. It's a matter of finding happiness, suddenly and against all probability, in a world where love is seldom true and never eternal. Not, that is, without the help of a little white magic at 7 3/8 halfpenny for the pint trade." "But isn't there anything you can do?" he asked. "An antidote or something?" "No." "Oh," Paul responded. "But even so, I don't think it's right. It's—" The slight twinge of pain inside his head could have been the voice scowling. "Stupid boy," said the voice. Sophie woke up. "Paul?" she said. "Hello?" She narrowed her eyes and squinted. "Yes, right," she said. "Only you look different somehow." Paul took a deep breath. "Yes," he said. "I thought you might say that. There's a reason." Sophie sat up and winced.
Crick neck, she explained. Have I been asleep or something?
Paul nodded. For about 20 minutes.
Oh,
she frowned.
What happened?
She said.
The last thing I can remember is that bastard making me drink the love stuff, only...
She hesitated, trying to make sense of what was in her mind.
Only he was going to make me fall in love with that funny little clerk with the pointy nose.
That's right, Paul said. Only that didn't happen. Yes, you drank the filter, but then...
Yes? Well?
Paul sighed. Mr. Wells, that's old Mr. Wells, the one who'd been lost. He turned out to be the long stapler, you know, the one that won't stay put for 5 minutes. I saw him, in that mirror thing that shows things as they really are. And I, kind of set him free. And he sorted out the other Mr. Wells, Humphrey, and basically that's it. You missed it all, of course.
I suppose so,
Sophie said. Old Mr. Wells, Paul went on quickly, John Wellington, he zapped Humphrey with lightning or something. Then he, changed him.
What do you mean changed?
He turned him into something, Paul said, with a touch of awe in his voice. You've never seen anything like it. One moment he was like, there. The next...
Paul,
Sophie warned him.
What did he turn him into?
Paul shivered a little as he answered. A photocopier, he replied. He reckoned that since he'd had to be a stapler all those years, it was only right and proper Humphrey should be some kind of office equipment too. And then he got this funny look in his eye, and he asked us, what's the most hated and abused piece of kit in an office? And we all said, the photocopier, without even having to be asked. Then John Wellington said that was what he reckoned too, and it'd serve Humphrey right to spend forever being thumped and yelled at and blamed every time something was late or got all chewed up, and then zap, and that was that.
Oh, well,
Sophie said.
But what about...
Paul looked away. It's all right, he said. I asked John Wellington about it. First he said, there's nothing anybody can do. But I kept on at him and he finally said yes. There's an antidote. All I've got to do is...
You,
Sophie interrupted. Paul nodded. All I've got to do, he said, is, swear, like this solemn oath that I'm finished with, girls, basically, and women, and all that sort of thing. And then I go away somewhere, and after a week or two, the filter wears off, and everything's fine. Sophie looked at him.
And what happens if you don't? I mean, if you break the oath?
Paul shrugged. He was a bit vague about that, he said. But from what I could gather, I sort of disintegrate, basically, and my soul's forfeit to a Raman's Prince of Darkness. He frowned. But that's all a bit academic, really, isn't it? Because, let's face it, me giving up women and stuff, it's like me abdicating the throne of England. What you're never going to have, you aren't going to miss.
Oh,
Sophie said.
But that's stupid.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't, Paul said irritably. It's what I want to do. Well, obviously it's not what I want to do, but it's the right thing, obviously.
Why?
He loved her with all his heart, but she could be annoying sometimes. Because otherwise, you'll be under the control of that bloody stuff and...
But I love you.
No, Paul said. That's just a filter. It's what makes you think.
No, you moron. I love you. Before the filter stuff.
Paul shook his head. No, he said. You thought you did, but probably by now you'll have realised you didn't. You were just having a funny 5 minutes or something. Or maybe you'd breathed in the fumes while we were up in Lancashire, or...
Paul!
She was getting angry.
Shut up, for crying out loud. Do you love me or don't you?
Well, yes, but...
Right. That's that then, she said,
and she lunged at him and kissed him.
Ouch,
she added, as their teeth collided. Sorry, Paul mumbled.
Bloody hell, look, just keep still, would you?
So Paul kept still for quite some time. Then once he'd got some feeling back in his jaw and lips, he said, Look, are you sure about this?
Paul!
All right, I was just asking. A few minutes later, someone knocked at the door. Is it, safe to come in?
That's John Wellington,
Paul whispered. Yes, he called. Yes, fine. The door opened and John Wellington came in, followed by Professor Van Spee, Mr. Suslovich, the Contessa di Castelbianco, Ricky Wormtorter, Pip, and finally Mr. Tanner.
Sit down, please, all of you, John Wellington said. You too, he added to Paul and Sophie, who jumped up looking guilty. We've got a lot to get through, so we won't waste any time.
He put his hand in his pocket and took out a paper bag, which Paul was sure he recognised.
Mr. Carpenter, John Wellington went on, I took the liberty of taking these from the drawer of your desk. You recognise them? Paul nodded. The dragon droppings, which made you hear what people meant, not what they said.
Excellent, John Wellington said. Now, we've all had a rough idea of what's happened here, but we've taken appropriate steps to deal with my nephew. But that, I'm afraid, isn't quite the end of the matter.
He frowned and looked slowly up and down the table.
From what I've gathered from my own observations as a stapler, an interesting perspective which some of you might find useful, and various things I've heard since I've been back, it seems to me that my wretched nephew wasn't acting entirely on his own. In fact, it seems quite likely that one of the other partners in his firm was either in the plot with him, or at least knew about it, but didn't say or do anything about it.
Very uncomfortable silence, with everyone looking at the floor or their folded hands.
Now, John Wellington went on, I suppose I could swallow some of these dragon droppings myself, and then question you in turn, and find out the truth. But if I were to do that, some of you might suspect that I'd use this as a pretext for getting rid of the one or more of you whom I don't like. After all, you'd have no way of knowing whether I was telling the truth or not. So instead, I'm going to ask Miss Pettingale and Mr. Carpenter to eat the beans. After all, they don't know which of you I'd want to see out of the way, so there's no reason why they wouldn't tell the truth. Agreed?
The other partners stayed still and quiet for a moment, and then slowly they all nodded their agreement.
Fine, said John Wellington, pushing the bag across the table. Miss Pettingale, Mr. Carpenter, if you'd both care to do the honours.
Sophie looked at him suspiciously, but something in his expression seemed to convince her that this wouldn't be a good time to make difficulties, and she swallowed 3 beans as if they were some sort of extremely nasty medicine. When Paul had done likewise, John Wellington cleared his throat.
First, he said, we'll try a little controlled experiment.
He took a pencil and wrote something on 2 pieces of paper, which he tucked in his top pocket.
First, he said, I'm going to say what's on one of these slips of paper while thinking something quite different, which is what I've written down on the other slip. Then Mr. Carpenter and Miss Pettingale will write down what they thought they heard me say, and we can compare the results.
He looked around the table.
Judy, he said, looking at the Contessa in the eye, did I ever happen to mention to you that your nose reminds me of a clothes peg dipped in a parsnip?
The Contessa smiled bleakly.
Go play with yourself, you randy old goat, she replied.
John Wellington nodded and then turned to Pip.
Would you tell us, please, he said, what you just heard me say to the Contessa and what she said in reply? Certainly, Pip answered. You told the Contessa that, if anything, she looks more beautiful now than she did 130 years ago. She replied that you always knew how to phrase a graceful compliment.
John Wellington nodded in acknowledgment.
Thank you, he said. Now, if Miss Pettingale and Mr. Carpenter will kindly pass him what they've written.
As he stood up to hand over the slip of paper, Paul couldn't help coming eye to eye with Mr. Tanner, just for a moment. And that was no fun at all, even though Mr. Tanner didn't say anything out loud. Pip unfolded the bits of paper and looked at them.
Well, said John Wellington.
Pip replied.
Actually, I'm having a little trouble with the handwriting. I don't think so, John Wellington said. Come on, man. Don't be shy.
Sorry, Pip replied, and the way he said it reminded Paul of someone he was accustomed to look at in mirrors. It's just, well, a bit personal, if you see what I mean.
No more personal than spending 130 years as a stapler, I'm sure. Hurry up, can't you?
Pip shrugged and read out the words, exactly as Paul had heard them. Sophie's version was identical. Countess Judy went bright pink, while John Wellington laughed.
It only goes to show, he said, what a frail instrument speech is. Anyhow, I think I've proved my point. Now we can start the investigation.
He turned round and stared hard at the other partners, one by one.
I think I can leave Mr. Wormtoter out of this, he went on, since he didn't join the firm until long after I disappeared. Then, he said, and for the first time Paul saw the professor look decidedly uncomfortable, we've never liked each other, of course. You're jealous of me, and I despise you, understandably enough.
but I wouldn't have thought you had the guts to plot against me, even when it looked like my idiot nephew had won. Well?" Professor Vansby stroked his beard before answering. "Nothing would give me greater pleasure than murdering you and selling your body to the cat food people," he replied gravely. "However, I genuinely believed you were dead." "Thank you," John Wellington said gravely. "Judy," he went on, "I remember discussing with you old John Hollingshead, who was running the Gaiety when you joined the chorus back in the early 1870s, he said. "She has the ambition of a junior minister and the morals of an alley cat. Even so, there's something about her I don't quite like. Was it you?" The Contessa smiled bleakly. "No," she said. "Excellent. Casimir, my old friend," John Wellington continued warmly, "most people would be convinced you're far too stupid to be devious, but I don't agree. You're stupid, certainly, but you're greedy as well. Did you know about what Humphrey did to me?" Mr. Suslovich looked as though he was about to burst into tears. "I came to this country with nothing, and I owe everything to you. Thank God you've come back to us, my good, kind friend, John Wells." "Splendid," said John Wellington, "which just leaves you, Dennis. I wouldn't put anything past you, even if I could find a barge pole that had reached that far. Was it you?" Mr. Tanner grinned. It was just his ordinary workaday grin. "It was nothing personal, J.W., he said. "How could there be? I never knew you. After all, I wasn't even born when it happened. It was only years later, after being with the firm for quite a while, that I found out what Humphrey had done. But I couldn't rescue you, because it had meant releasing that disgusting little clerk who knocked up my father, he added with a leer that showed his teeth. If there had been any way to get you out without letting him go too, I'd have done it, just to get rid of Humphrey." "Thank you," said John Wellington. But Mr. Tanner went on speaking, or at least his voice kept going in Paul's mind. "And now," Mr. Tanner was saying, "he's back again, and my mother's up to her old tricks again. And if that's not bad enough, she's been chasing off this pathetic dribbler of Trollsnot. Well, we'll have to put a stop to that, just as soon as your back's turned. Only this time there won't be any talismans or any of that shit." "Shut the fuck up," said John Wellington, so politely that it took Paul a moment to remember that it probably wasn't what he'd actually said. He didn't look like Arthur Lowe anymore. He was angry, that was obvious enough, but he had the anger completely under control, like someone who's scooped up a small, furiously barking dog and is holding it well clear off the ground, its feet scrabbling wildly and to no effect. "Thank you," Paul heard him say. "Actually, I don't think we need Miss Pettingell and Mr. Carpenter to translate for us. The gist of the matter seems pretty clear, don't you think?" Paul looked across and saw the other partners were sitting very still, looking distinctly shocked and uncomfortable. Mr. Tanner drew a deep breath. "Fine," he said. "So that's it, I suppose. I'm out. No use me pointing out that my family owns this building or anything like that." John Wellington looked rather serious. "If you're trying to blackmail me," he said, "forget it. But you're underestimating me as always. No, Dennis, you aren't out at all. In fact, you have my sympathy. It can't be easy for you, having a mother like that. And after all, you were the one who insisted on taking on our two young friends here. I was in this very room during the interview, remember? When Humphrey was so determined they shouldn't be hired. And you forced the rest of them to change their minds and vote him down. I think you knew then that they were the ones who'd set things to rights, and you sent them the swords and the stones, and stage-managed that little pantomime that brought them together that evening when Mr. Carpenter brought the frozen pizza. Quite the matchmaker," he added with a twitch of his eyebrow. "They ought to be grateful to you for the rest of their lives." Mr. Tanner shrugged. "That was purely self-defence," he said. "I wanted to make sure he'd stay away from my mother." Sophie looked as though she was about to say something, but must have thought better of it. John Wellington winked at her. She went pink and subsided. "Well," he continued, "at least we've got that cleared up. As for the two of you," he added, turning to Paul and Sophie, "I think we all have to rely on your discretion if this firm's going to continue working together. But that's not a problem, is it?" Sophie had to kick Paul's ankle under the table. Then he nodded vigorously and said, "Absolutely, that's right," or words to that effect. John Wellington stood up. "Excellent," he said. In that case, I think we've covered everything that needs immediate attention. Casimir and Julie, I'd like a word with you, if I may. My office in 10 minutes, please. The rest of you—" His slight shrug was enough to get them going, like a stone thrown into a crowd of ducks on a pond. A moment later, there were only 3 people left in the room: Paul, Sophie, and Mr. Tanner. They looked at him and he grinned.
"Is that right?" Sophie said. "What he told us? About you?"
"Yes," said Mr. Tanner. "Dressed me in nappies and gave me a bow and arrow, and I'm Cupid. And yes, it was me insisted that you 2 got hired, but he's wrong about one thing. I only did that because I could see you were both right for the job. Naturals, both of you." He laughed suddenly. "But that was bloody obvious, even though the rest of the other idiots couldn't see it. Supposed to be wizards and sorcerers, couldn't see the painfully obvious. Nah, it took a poxy little goblin to do that."
Sophie frowned.
"I don't understand," she said. "What was so obvious?"
Mr. Tanner's grin was broader than ever.
"Ah," he said, "that'd be telling. But you don't need me to tell you you're both more than capable of figuring it out for yourselves."
"Oh," said Sophie. "Suit yourself then, and—"
"What?"
"Thanks,"
Sophie replied awkwardly.
"Oh, I know you weren't thinking of us, but,"
she added, taking hold of Paul's arm,
"thanks anyway."
Mr. Tanner laughed as if he had just heard a really funny story.
"Wait and see what happens before you thank me," he said. "Could be you'll be sticking pins in a little wax effigy of me this time next year."
Sophie shook her head.
"I don't think so,"
she said quietly.
"No? Well, you'll be right."
Mr. Tanner shrugged.
"We'll see, one way or another. One thing's for sure. There's absolutely no way you 2 had found the happy ending left to yourselves. When it comes to knowing what's good for you, I've met smarter lemmings. You're on your own now, though, unless the old bastard means to look after you. In which case," he added, "you'll probably be all right. Can't say as I like him much, but he's no fool."
He turned to go, but then he stopped, swung round and looked at them.
"One last thing," he said. "Well, 2 actually. First, welcome to the profession, and I think that now we've all got this shit out of the way, we can probably work well together. Second," he added, giving Paul a long, cold stare, "you stay the hell away from my mother, understood? Because otherwise, if Sophie here doesn't kill you, I bloody will."
Paul nodded quickly 3 times and headed for the door. But there was something he had to ask somebody, and if anybody knew, Mr. Tanner probably did. He turned back. "Excuse me," he said. "Can I ask you something?" Mr. Tanner frowned.
"Depends what it is," he said.
Paul bit his lip. "Look," he said, "if I was to ask you why Gilbert and Sullivan, for God's sake, would that question make any sense to you?" Mr. Tanner raised an eyebrow, and then he laughed.
"Perfect sense," he said. "I take it you're not into light opera then?"
"No."
"Me neither. But if you want to know, look in the drawer of that desk over there, and you'll find a copy of the collected works of Gilbert and Sullivan. From memory, I think you'll find what you're after on page 556. It's probably bookmarked, and you'll see why."
The book was exactly where Mr. Tanner had said it would be. Page 556 turned out to be a scene from something called The Sorcerer, which, according to the introduction at the front, was first performed on 17th November 1877. The song that Mr. Tanner probably had in mind went, "My name is J.W.Wells. I'm a dealer in magic and spells, in blessings and curses and never-filled purses, in prophecies, witches and knells. If you want a proud foe to make tracks, if you'd melt a rich uncle in wax, you've but to look in on the resident gin, number 70, St. Mary Axe." Not much happened after that, except that Paul and Sophie, thrown out of the office because it was well past 5:30, wandered around for a while, talking of this and that, and then Sophie explained, with unusual tact, that although she loved him very much, she was also dead on her feet after a long and eventful day, and they still had to be in the office next morning at 9 sharp. So he left her and wandered about on his own for a bit, and eventually wound up back at his flat. 2 things caught his attention as he opened the door. The first was that the sword and the stone wasn't there anymore, but he remembered why. The second was that Sophie rushed across the room to meet him and flung herself into his arms like a soft cannonball. The kiss was wonderful, of course, but even so, Paul found himself thinking, "This is odd." First, she didn't seem the least bit tired. Second, how had she managed to get in? Third, no embarrassing collision of front teeth or process of, "Ouch, you're hurting my neck." He pushed her gently away and said, "Hang on." She fended his hand away, but he stepped back, and then she grinned. "Oh," Paul said, "you."
She sighed, and then she turned back into Mr. Tanner's mum. "You guessed," she said. "It wasn't difficult," Paul replied irritably. "Bugger. Still, you can't blame a girl for trying." "I can, actually. What about what's-his-name?" he said. "Arthur," he remembered. "I thought you two were—"
"Oh, we are,"
Mr. Tanner's mum replied, yawning.
"But then he's only human. He fell asleep, and I wasn't tired, so I thought, why not? After all," she went on as Paul scowled at her, "what's the point of being a goblin if you can't be all shallow and one-track-minded? It's what goblins do. Ghouls just want to have fun and all that."
Paul went and stood by the door. "Goodbye," he said. "I won't mention this to your son, not this time." She stuck her tongue out at him and then sat down in the armchair.
"You know what?" she said. "You're about as much fun as a boil in the bum. God only knows what I see in you."
"Good," Paul said. "Please go away."
"In a second," said Mr. Tanner's mum.
Then from thin air she produced the little glass ball.
"Or don't you want to see if it all works out for you? Or if the first thing she says to you tomorrow morning is, 'April Fool, just kidding'?"
"As a matter of fact," Paul said. "No, I don't." She laughed.
"Scared?"
He shook his head. "Not really. I just believe in her rather more than I do in you. That's all." She didn't like that.
"Tough," she said. "You're going to find out anyway, and I hope she—"
"Oh." Mr. Tanner's mum put the glass ball down on the table. "Bugger," she said. Paul's curiosity got the better of him, and he peered down at it. And then he jumped back, grabbed a disused shirt off the back of the sofa, and covered the ball with it.
"Spoil sport," said Mr. Tanner's mum, grinning ferociously. "I was enjoying that."
"You're disgusting."
"And proud of it."
She tried to pull the shirt away, but he grabbed her hand.
"I'll say this for you," she went on. "If that's anything to go by, you're a quick learner. I'm not sure if I've ever tried that one myself."
"Get out," Paul mumbled.
"Looked a bit dodgy to me. It'd do your back for one thing."
"Out!"
"All right,"
Mr. Tanner's mum sighed, as she stood up and dropped the glass ball in her bag.
"You win, for now anyway. I'm patient," she added. "I can wait. I'll get there in the end, you know. I generally do."
Paul shook his head. "Not this time."
"Well, we'll see then, won't we?" That grin again. "And for crying out loud, lighten up a bit, will you? Looks like you get your happy ending after all."
"Yes," Paul said firmly.
"If you can call it that," said Mr. Tanner's mum. "Because you know what'll happen, don't you? 10 years from now, 15, even 20, you'll think back to today and you'll wish you'd had more bloody sense. Oh, I can see you then. Don't need a crystal ball for that. There's you, getting thick around the middle, thin on top. There's her, starting to sag and pucker. There's the two of you bickering about money, or the kids who are having to visit her mum when you've got a whole lot of work you've brought home with you. 20 years of that, you get less for armed robbery, plus time off for good behaviour. You can have your happy ending, Sunbeam. You deserve it."
Paul thought about what she had said, and then grabbed her by the scruff of the neck and marched her to the door. "Really?" he said, and smiled happily. "Thank you." And then he threw her out. "There's just one thing," Paul said. It was 4 days later, and still she hadn't changed her mind. It was their first Saturday together, and it had all turned out to be quite different from the one he'd expected. Different, but better. But there was just one thing.
"What?"
Sophie asked. He hesitated. He didn't really need to ask this question. In all probability, it'd be better if he didn't. It wasn't something he actually needed to know, and the mere act of asking it was something of a betrayal of trust. Anybody with half a brain and slightly more tact than a bomb would forget about it, or at the very least leave well enough alone. But, "What's his name?" Paul said. "Shaz, the ceramic artist. What happened?" She looked at him. It's all right," he said quickly. I shouldn't—"
"No," she said. "That's okay. It's just a bit embarrassing, that's all. You see, well, you know the tabletop in the boardroom, the one that shows things the way they really are?"
Paul nodded. "Imperfecting mirror, Mr. Wormtoter called it."
"That's right," she said. "Well, it doesn't have to be a mirror or a tabletop," she frowned. "Apparently you can get the same effect with a bit of ordinary tinfoil."
Paul looked puzzled. "Tinfoil?"
"Yes. You know, what you cook the Christmas turkey in. Only," she went on, looking past him, "someone got into Shaz's bus and stuck a sheet of it up on the ceiling, right over the bed."
For a moment, Paul didn't quite follow. Then he said, "Oh."
"Yes."
"Reflecting tinfoil?" She scowled.
"It works just like the tabletop did," she said. Later, when he came round after I'd bashed him on the head with a saucepan, he told me who he really was."
Paul didn't ask, but after a long pause she went on.
"I'm not quite sure how these things go, but I think he's Mr. Tanner's second cousin, or else his first cousin once removed. Anyhow, his name was George, and he reckoned that Mr. Tanner's mother put him up to it, to keep us apart so she could get you, and it was like nothing personal, but—"
"Mr. Tanner's cousin? You mean it got—"
"Yes."
"Oh."
Just for a moment, Paul thought about the portable door, a quick dash back to the recent past, say 5 seconds before he'd asked a bloody stupid question that had prompted all of this. But he decided not to. It'd be cheating, and he was through with all of that. He said, "Do you know who put it there? The tinfoil, I mean?" She shook her head.
"Not for certain," she said grimly, "but I don't think it's a coincidence that it was stapled to the ceiling rather than glued or sellotaped."
"Right," Paul said thoughtfully. "But listen, if you hadn't been Mr. Tanner's cousin, what I mean is you chose him rather than me, and that's fine, I guess, because it turned out all right in the end. But I can't help wondering, did you drink any of that filter stuff? I mean, by accident or whatever, because you put it in my tea on the train? Only I can remember buying that bottle of champagne in the pub to put the stuff in so that horrible woman would fall in love with the film bloke, Ashford Clent, and I remember they gave us 2 glasses, and I put the stuff in 1 glass, and then you said you really needed a drink because it was so nerve-wracking, and I can remember it crossing my mind to tell you I'd lace one of the glasses so you wouldn't put any of the stuff in the other one as well, but I'm not absolutely certain. I did warn you, and—"
"Paul."
"Yes?" Sophie was looking at him with an expression such as might be found on the face of a large but compassionate paratrooper when informed in a public house by a small elderly drunk that only cowards wear little purple berets.
"Do you really want me to tell you?"
Paul thought about it for a little while. Yes, he said.
"You do?"
Yes.
"Oh."
So she told him, and then she looked at him again and said,
"Do you believe me?"
And Paul thought for another little while and looked away and said, "Yes."
"Fine."
She folded her arms.
"I was right, wasn't I? You didn't really want me to tell you."
"Yes." She nodded.
"I did warn you."
"Yes, you did. I thought I wanted to know." He shrugged. "It occurs to me," he said, "that unless I get elected Prime Minister or assassinate the Pope or something, I'm always going to be my own worst enemy. Comes of being stupid, I suppose."
"Probably."
She scowled at him, and then the smile gradually morphed into a grin.
"Bet you wish you'd never raised the subject in the first place."
"Yes," said Paul.
"Bet you wish you could go back in time to the moment before you raised the subject, and then something had happened that would drive the whole thing out of your mind. As if," she said, "by magic."
A tiny light flickered behind Paul's eyes as he reached into his inside coat pocket. "Wouldn't that be something?" he said, taking the top of the cardboard tube that contained the portable door.